let's say you're a man, a powerful man, who wants to grab another human being by a certain part of the body. I mean, guys will admit to having those impulses. But to act them out, that speaks to poor impulse regulation. Typical of ADHD. Typical also of addiction. When you do brain scans on drug addicts, the commonest brain finding is abnormality in that part of the brain that regulates impulses. So as somebody very astutely said about addiction, the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't. There's nothing to say no with. So that's the third major brain circuit involved in addiction. I mentioned the opiates, I mentioned the dopamine, incentive motivation, now impulse regulation. And then fourthly, if you look at your own experience with, by the way, it's very difficult these days to be in the world and not make comments on American politics. Well, simply because I believe what we're seeing on a national level is the acting out of terrible trauma. I've just never seen trauma expressed. Well, I have seen it, but I've not seen it in your country. Which is not totally true either. But not to this degree, let me put it that way. But in any case, if I asked you this question, if you had an addiction, you gave it up for a while, then you relapsed, what made you relapse usually? Who would say? Something stressful, right. So the problem with the addicts is they don't have stress regulation. Now stress is simply a reaction to a threat. We're meant to have stress. If I threaten you, you should be stressed, because if you're stressed, you have adrenaline and cortisol and more energy and stronger muscles and a faster heartbeat, more oxygen to your muscles. Your nervous system would be poised to alertness. That's great. But if you're constantly stressed, that's going to make you sick, and I'll talk to you about that this afternoon. So there has to be stress regulation, and there is a stress regulation circuitry in the brain that dampens the stress response. Addicts don't have that so well, so they use the addiction to regulate their stresses. So that one of the triggers for my own addictive behaviors would have been when I was stressed. And given how I lived my life, I stressed myself a lot, so I had lots of reasons to act out my addictions. So poor stress regulation then. So these are the circuits, not the only ones, but the major ones that are involved in addiction. So if you look at these circuits in the brain, and they have, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Dr. Nora Volkow, has done brilliant brain scans showing abnormality in all these areas. Therefore, you can say, you've got a brain disease here. There's only one problem with that hypothesis. It misses asking a basic question. How does the brain actually develop? What makes the brain the way it is? Now, one assumption is that it's your genes. Only that's not it's a false assumption. It's not actually the genes that make the brain. I'm going to read you now from an article that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Association. Sorry, the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And this was published in 2012. And this article collates, brings together a lot of information that have been around for about 20 years. And here's what they say about brain development. So what you have to understand about the human brain is that most of the development occurs after birth. Compared to a horse, say, which can run on the first day of life, human beings can't muster that muscle control, coordination, visual acuity, balance, strength for a year and a half, 2 years. So the horse is 18 to 24 months ahead of us in terms of brain development, which we can't afford to be at that level before we're born, because then we would never be born. As you already know, those of you that have given birth here, the head is the biggest part of the body. And if anything gets stuck in the birth canal, it's going to be usually the head. So we can't afford to have larger heads, which means we have to be born with premature brains compared to other mammals, which means the first few years of life are crucial, years of brain development. And what is it that shapes the brain? I'm quoting from the Harvard article now, from the Journal of Pediatrics, 2012. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior. And follow, they didn't say some of the health, learning, and behavior. They said all the health and learning. So it's a process that begins before birth. In my book, Addiction, in the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, in the appendix on prevention, I say that the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit. Because the emotional states of the mother are affecting the neurological development of the infant. When the mothers are stressed, they have high levels of cortisol and adrenaline. That doesn't stop at the placental barrier. That gets transmitted to the baby through the umbilical cord. When the mother's stressed or anxious, we can measure the baby's heart response. And chronic stress on the mother will have negative effects on the infant. So that child will have abnormal stress hormone levels long after birth. Now he or she is at more risk for addiction. They'll have abnormal dopamine activity because stress reduces dopamine receptors. We can stress pregnant animals in the laboratory. Their offspring will be more likely to use alcohol and cocaine as adults to soothe themselves. So during intrauterine life already, we're dealing with the potentiation of health or the lack of it. I can also talk to you at length, but I'm not going to, about medicalized birth practices that actually interfere with the bonding between mother and child. I used to practice this, so I know what I'm talking about. Enough said. I'm going to go on to the next paragraph. It's the key one. The interactions of genes and experiences. And by the way, if I speak with some heat about these issues, it's not because I'm critical of your country or any other country. It's because when we know so much, when the evidence is in, when the science is clear, it is challenging to deal with a system that completely ignores human experience and human science and doesn't even debate these issues significantly. I mean, even the Surgeon General's report completely missed the long-established science of brain development. Astonishing. What I'm telling you here is not taught in any of the medical schools. And it's not even controversial. It's just that it's a swath of evidence that we ignore. So the next paragraph. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by, so it's not genes, it's the interaction of genes and experiences. Genes are turned on and off by the environment. You can have two people with the same genes behave totally differently depending on whether those genes were turned on or off by the environment. Genes don't determine human behavior. They predispose, but they don't determine. You can have children, this has been shown in the States in studies, that children who may have certain genes that might predispose to addiction, if they're brought up in a good environment, the risk of addiction is no greater than that of other kids. Animals, the same thing. Genes don't determine addiction. It's complete nonsense. scientifically. And if you want to talk to me about that in your questions, I'll explain more about it. But I mean, I just assert for you now that the assumptions that underlie the genetic studies on addiction are so transparently shallow. You have to wonder, why is it that we keep clinging to that hypothesis? Why do we keep clinging to that hypothesis? Because it allows us not to look at society and family life and our own histories. That's why we keep clinging to those theories. I'm not getting to this paragraph, am I? The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the key influence on the development of all these crucial brain circuits is what? The quality of parent-child relationships. I'm not talking about whether parents love their kids or not. It's not the issue. I'm talking about what is the state of mind of the parent. Is the parent able to be responsive to the child? Or is the parent too stressed because of their own trauma or social issues or economics or whatever it is? Are they too depressed, anxious, distracted? Their lifestyle, is it so hairy and busy? These are the issues that define whether parents can be responsive to the child. And if they can't, that'll have a negative impact on the brain development, because that interaction literally shapes the physiology of the brain. You know what I said? We're biopsychosocial creatures. Our brain development is determined by our emotional environment. Now, what do we find when we look at drug addicts? Specifically drug addicts, but any addict, actually. Well, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, in 12 years of work, having dealt with hundreds of addicted people, I never met a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. If you work with addictions, hardcore addicts who are female, those who had not been sexually abused will be a minority. And sexual abuse shows up in how the brain looks 15, 20 years later. All the men I had dealt with in the downtown east side had been abused sexually or in other ways. The minority sexually, but in other ways for sure. That was my particular experience and observation. That would also be anybody's experience and observation if you ask the right questions. But we're not even trained to ask these questions. And it's astonishing to me how many addiction specialists never ask about any depth about what happened to you in childhood. It just doesn't come up. And yet these are the factors that shape the personality and the brain.